This is quite an event. It's quite not the event here, the event that the East Tennessee Angus Association's been in existence for 100 years. You know, you sometimes think about what were those guys that had that first sale, what were they going through? As someone that's had the experience of having a first sale or a 25th sale and all the sales in between, I know kind of how it feels to do that, and sometimes it doesn't feel real good. Sometimes you get a little worked up and you get a little nervous. Now, Tom never gets worked up or nervous, but sometimes the owner does. I'm here to testify that is a fact. You're really glad that it's over. That's exactly right. You are. And people are laughing, so some of you know that feeling. But you think back on the history and the history of events and how things happened and why they've happened and why they've persevered. It's really a neat thing that this organization has persevered for 100 years. I've had the opportunity to be involved in it some 40 plus years, I guess. I hate to own up to, but so not quite half of the experience, but I have been involved on and off for that period of time. It was an organization my father recognized as being important, and it was a big trip when we went to Knoxville to see the East Tennessee Angus show on Friday before the sale on Saturday. When I was 10, 12, I don't know exactly how old, maybe a little bit younger than that the first time. But that was quite an experience, and it was a big deal, and it was important to him because some of the leading cattlemen in the area had brought their livestock to that event, and it was a wonderful event at the university. Seeing since that time some of the harder times this organization's went through the 80s and 90s and even the early parts of the 2000s, I think that makes it even more interesting. I mean, that speaks well for the character of a lot of the people that are in this room that saw that its organization persevered through those harder, a little bit tougher times. They had some decisions to make. They had some things to change. And you know, if you were there, and I know a lot of you were back in March at that banquet in Knoxville, I mean, it had to be one of the largest and best banquets ever. You know, an organization comes together like that and puts on an event like that and is able to raise as much money for their youth program and their scholarship program. I mean, that's quite a testament to the strength of this organization. So we're certainly flattered to be asked to host this lunch today, and we're really glad that you're here. So what I propose to do is share a little bit of the history of our farm and who we are and how we came to be here, a little bit about what we do. And then for some activities, I've got some cattle up that were on this part of the farm that you can look at. Dwight had suggested sometimes people like to look at some working facilities, and basically you can start either out that edge or out this edge and can look at some cattle, walk on down to that barn. Our sale lots for sale day are down there. Obviously we have the sale in here, but our lots are there, and then up into the brown barns where our main working facilities are. Another place, and I'm not really equipped to take everyone, but there's a mule around here and there's an old red truck over there. If somebody wants to get in it and follow this lane back through there till you come to the next working facility, one of the few ideas that probably wasn't original to me, I got it somewhere. It just took me about 25 or 30 years to come up with it, but we have a lane that kind of goes through this part of the farm. I'd had a corral there through most of my youth, childhood, college, growing up. I never had enough sense to figure out if I'd just make me a fence down across that road, another 100 feet, and put gates on each side, it'd really be easy to catch cattle and work in there. So if y'all want to ride back there and look at it, you're welcome to. Probably the most interesting fact about that, and my kids kind of got into it this summer, is apparently there used to be an Indian camp there. Who knows what kind of Indians? My oldest daughter's researched it. She thinks it was about 1,000 years ago. She thinks it was late woodland Indians. You can walk back, you find all kinds of pieces of flint. Obviously over the years people have got the arrowheads, the spearheads, but this summer I found little pendants and things like that. And just thinking back to what all went on the land and what those people did and what they look like, it's kind of fascinating to me. I don't know if anybody's into history here, if everybody just loves cattle, but I think that's kind of neat. And you're certainly welcome to any means that we own to take it back there. It's about a half mile or so and look at it. So now I'm going to start on the paper about what I was actually going to talk about, okay? The history of our farm actually began with my grandfather. My grandfather grew up, he was born in 1909, he grew up in rural North Georgia in the mountains. Grew up in Union County, and those of you that ever saw the movie Deliverance years ago, that's where it was filmed, and it was about the people that grew up in that area. I don't know quite how it came to pass, and I never will because no one ever told me, and everyone that could's now deceased. But his family believed in education. His father was the oldest of 3 brothers. He sent his 2 younger brothers to school. They became lawyers. They became very successful lawyers. He had stayed and he had a store, and my grandfather and his younger brother, he sent them to school. They both became veterinarians. My grandfather graduated from the University of Georgia Veterinary School in 1929. Coincides with the Depression. I still have some of his old textbooks and stuff from Lumpkin Street in Athens. It's pretty neat. It's pretty neat the way they looked at things and the way they did things. But he grew up loving cattle and loving livestock. They had a few cows, and of course there's no pictures of them. It would be something to have if there were pictures of what kind of cows they had. But I still do have some of the bells, I should have brought them I guess, that they put around their neck. And they ran them up in the mountains and they used the bells to find them. And the story is, from the time he was a young child, he really liked the cows, and he was the brother that always went and checked the cows. He took care of the cows. That was something that was very important to him. So about 1933, the year my father was born, he and his wife and my young father moved to Greene County. He'd done his research. He'd been out of school a little while. Before internet, he'd even done research on something, and he'd somehow or another figured out that there were a lot of beef and dairy cattle in Greene County. And I don't know where Greene County ranked in 1933, but for years it's always been 1, 2, 3 for beef and dairy cow numbers both in the state of Tennessee. So that's why he came to Greene County. Of course, he had to survive the Depression, had to deal with raising my father, and they had to have World War II. Which is something, my dad had told me stories about how the civilians were and how you had to ration things. And my grandfather had an unlimited gas card, so he could get all the gas he wanted in World War II, but he would only be going to somebody's farm if he were out driving. They were so rationed, I guess, in this area that he was afraid to be out. He didn't want to. That was your duty. That was the only war in my lifetime that we fought that we didn't think we were going to win, or we didn't know if we could win. It was, where the population actually felt a struggle. So to me, all that was interesting. My dad had related these stories to me over the years and told me what they'd done. But following World War II, he and his younger brother Jack bought the piece of property that's that direction. It's over behind where my grandparents' house was, and it's the first house on the left going back to town. But they bought that piece of property and they got some commercial cows, and this would have been in the late 40s and the early 50s. My father graduated from veterinary school in 1959 and returned to Greenville and started to work. And like any good family does, you have to have a little family problems. You have to have a little family fuss, apparently. So there was a fuss between my grandfather and my Uncle Jack. And again, no one will know what that was about because no one ever told me, and they're all gone, so I don't know. But apparently it was pretty severe. So my Uncle Jack started his own practice at a different location in Greene County. My dad and my grandfather worked together. For the remainder of my grandfather's life, my dad bought Jack's interest in this property out, and they were in business together, running commercial cows. Backing up a little bit, my grandfather's first office was in the old stockyard in Greenville. That's where the water department is. From those of y'all that are familiar with Greenville, it's where the water department is now, but that was the only stockyard in Greenville at that time. He had one little room and it had a sink in it. So I predict that was quite an advancement for a veterinary office at that point in time. Of course, there was no small animal practice. There was no small animal work. My grandfather never did small animal work. It was all centered around cattle. So his brother, Jack, liked horses, so my grandfather hated horses, naturally. So it was all cattle. It was all cattle that he did. And he grew up, and when I was older and out of school, I realized that a lot of the friends that he met at that point in time turned out to be lifelong friends. I meet an older gentleman that passes away not so long after I'm out of school, but along the way I learned that he was a basically orphan child that worked for my grandfather in that stockyard, that taught himself to be an auctioneer, that bought the stockyard and owned it and ran it. You don't get, that's Son Fannin for y'all that are from Greenville or are familiar with the name. And Son was able to sell a few cattle after I got out of school, after I was, quote, an adult, I suppose. But, you know, interesting story, you know, how they did things and what they did. But his love for cattle is why they're here. I got a little emotional over son, so I better look at my paper and get back kind of where I'm supposed to be. So they started with the cattle late 50s, 60s. They didn't have any registered cattle. 1966, my dad's thinking was a little different than my grandfather's. I guess my grandfather, if he had something to eat, had a roof over his head, the fact that he had a little bit of land and a few cows to him was tremendous, because they didn't have nothing where he came from. I mean, just a little mountain farm and just a few cows. It's tremendous. These hills back here, back then when I was a kid, he'd go back there on Saturday afternoons and he would look at his cows and he'd listen to Georgia football on the AM radio. That's what he liked to do. But any Saturday afternoon, if the Bulldogs were playing, he was back there on whichever hill he got the best reception on that day. And he was pretty darn serious about it. So I already told you my dad graduated from Auburn, he graduated from Georgia, and everybody else in Greene County went to Tennessee. So when I was growing up in the falls on Saturday afternoons, and all through the week, there was plenty of talking about athletics and about sports, and they all really enjoyed doing that. My dad looked at things a little different. He believed in science, and he understood genetics. He understood why things happen the way they do. He had raised, with the help of my grandfather was a little different. He was more of they had foxhounds. He was more of a field trial guy. You know, more dogs were designed to run the fox. I don't know if anybody's familiar with fox hunting anymore or not, but when they have a field trial, it's not like the horns and horses like you see on TV, but they'd have judges out that drove around the roads and tried to get at strategic points to see the dogs, to see if they're trailing or if they're hunting or if they're actually running a fox, the speed and drive. Dog has a number painted on its side and it gets a score from that judge. So my grandfather was into that. My dad liked for him to look good. He liked for him to look good. So he had some show dogs, but he didn't want them just to look good. He wanted them to be able to run too. He wanted to win the show, and he wanted to, I mean, now it takes, if you think about that, you got to rely on your dog to be seen. He wants to at least be at the top of the field, and he definitely doesn't want to be scratched. That was the dogs that just wouldn't do anything that came back to where they were cast from. That's a scratch, if you're not familiar. But he wanted a dog that would do both, and he was very successful at that. He had 3 national bench champions, the dogs that would also finish the field trial. You know, those dogs would run. And that kind of was playing out as I was growing up. I can remember going to a few shows with them. I don't remember the ones they won. That was in the 60s and the early 70s, very early 70s. They may not have taken me. I wouldn't blame them if they didn't, but that kind of played out. But he understood that. He understood how to breed those dogs. He understood line breeding in those dogs. That was his thing. He liked to breed like to like, and if they happened to be related a little bit, it didn't bother him a bit. He just thought it accentuated the positives. So it was kind of something that carried over. He believed the same thing about cattle. But he believed about implementing technology into what we did. So 1966, he buys a few registered cows and he buys a registered bull, and they have registered cows. How many people know what registered Angus cattle looked like in the late 60s and early 70s? Tom? Baby beef. Okay? He's working in his veterinary practice. He's really active in large animal practice, so he does a lot of work for some of the most influential Angus herds in the area. And it comes to him, this isn't right. And he told me this, if I have to get on my knees to pull a calf out of an Angus cow, something's not right. You know, he was basically raised in the stockyard, because at that time that's where my grandfather's office was. He knew people were paid by the pound for their cattle. How can this be right? So he felt the need for change. I need to do something different. So in the early 70s, he'd done his research, again without the internet. I guess he relied on the Angus Journal, which would be a little scary at times, wouldn't it, Tom? But I know he'd relied on it at least some. But he met Bill Corbin, or Carlton Corbin Jr. in Kansas. And Bill believed in performance testing. He also believed in feed efficiency testing and was doing it at that point in time. My dad, I can still remember him telling me, I'm like a little kid. Well, I remember the day we went and rounded up the other bulls here, and it was like a little mini rodeo. I'm sure they weren't very big, but they looked big to me then. And they were fighting, so that looked like a big deal to me. But he sold them, and he went and bought more bulls, and he brought them in. And I said, so why'd you do that? I remember asking him. He said, well, son, yearling weight's the most heritable trait. He said, these bulls have more yearling weight. They're bigger bulls. We're going to have more pounds of calves to sell. And years had gone by. I was an adult before I'd ever thought to ask him, when you did all that, how much difference did it make? He said the first set of calves that they sold from those bulls were about 50 pounds heavier. And all they were measuring was the day they sold them, and they sold in the same feeder calf sales. Those of you that remember, feeder calf sales were real popular in that day and time. They sold in those same feeder calf sales. And he said we gained about 50 pounds of weight. Well, I know myself that the calves would have been 450 pound and a big calf would have been a 500 pound calf at that point in time. So it was a pretty significant difference that introducing the performance tested bulls made to his program. So he's kind of sold on doing that. Early 70s, that's when he got the bulls and stuff. Then moving on into the later 70s, we kind of made a mistake then. Not a mistake in what I'm going to say now, I'll get to it, I guess. Along the way, I was growing up. So what a lot of kids do growing up, they want to show a calf. I liked halter breaking calves. I liked working with cattle. Thought it'd be a great idea to show a few calves. So we did. We began showing calves. And those of you that remember how little they were in the late 60s, early 70s, you remember what they looked like in the mid to late 80s? Completely opposite. They got kind of tall. Some would say they got a little narrow. And I can tell you for an absolute fact, that kind of cattle in this environment didn't work very well. So I'm in college through the mid to late part of the 80s, well actually early 90s before I got out of veterinary school. He's here. He's got cows that won't take their calf when they calve as a heifer. If they do, they don't have a whole lot of milk. The calves don't do very well. Something's got to change. Now, from that period of the early 80s, what did he not have? He didn't have any estimated breeding values. He didn't have any EPDs. He didn't have anything to select cattle by other than what someone told him or what he read or what he thought. But he'd changed a little bit from his original performance beliefs, I guess, to kind of humor me. And, you know, that was back in the day. It was a pretty persuasive argument because all you saw were the show bulls and what people were doing, what people were selling, and things were going pretty well with those cattle. But he found out they wouldn't work here. So now I've arrived at the point in my life where I know kind of what he was thinking. Well, I've got kids in college. I know one's not going to be back. I don't have any idea what Lee's going to do. What am I going to do? I've got to have some cattle that have some function and fit my environment. So it's kind of time for a change again then. And he took some advice for some other Angus breeders, and he invested in not a fancy bull by any means. He was just looking for a bull with some function. He bought a bull from Harvey Lemon at that point in time. It's an old power play son that I can remember well, and he brought him in, and that bull introduced some function back into the cattle. He was a little more moderate, he's a little thicker. The daughters would own a calf and raise a calf, and we got a little more function back into what we were doing. An interesting thing through the 80s that I can remember is when Ludolice came out. I remember he wanted to AI some cows. Never heard of the drug. I guess the drug rep had been in and detailed him on it. So we're going to synchronize these cows and we're going to artificial breed them. And if you go about another quarter mile past where I told you that corral was back through there, you'll come to an old barn that was a tobacco barn. It had one of these little single slot chutes that you had to push the handle over and put a bolt in to hold the cow's head. That's where we AI'd the cattle that he had synchronized with Ludolice back in the day. But I can remember that. We didn't get along too good, but a few of them got pregnant. But it was the first step in learning how to do that. Now, when I think back on it, I can't imagine doing it without seeders and knowing they're all going to be in heat next Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning, and I can get them bred and move on to something else. But just having to go check every single day, waiting on one to be in heat, I couldn't imagine doing that in this day and time. But the advent of Ludolice was certainly a big deal and something that I can remember here, I guess, from our history. And basically the changes he made in the mid to late 80s and early 90s with the way he selected cattle and the way he looked at things while he was waiting on me to figure out what I was going to do, I suppose, was just he didn't tell me that. I just looking back on it, knowing how it feels to be a father with two kids in college now, wondering what they're going to do and wondering what the future is. I figure that's about how he had to be thinking then. But he recognized the performance of performing in their environment and that what we do here is a little bit different than what people do across the country. and he had to find some function in them. So today, what do we do? If you have questions or want to ask, or if you want to just get something to drink or do something else, you're certainly welcome to do that during any of this. But I was just going to share a little with what we've done. Today, the goal is to produce bulls for the commercial cattlemen that will excel in our environment under practical management conditions. We select genetics from programs that do things kind of like we do. Okay? You notice today, it's me and my wife, my mother, right here, okay? Which I should introduce to start with. I'm probably already in trouble. I guess I should back up now with that thought, okay? With us today, we have my mother. Let me introduce her. Thank you all. You saved me on that one, okay? And my wife. I have one older gentleman that's mowing a little hay for me right now that helps us on the farm. I have a younger gentleman that worked for me full-time when he first got out of school. He's kind of outgrown me, and he helps me with the sale, and he helps me with the corn. But other than that, this is kind of what we got. This is kind of how we do things here. And I guess that would have been important to mention from the get-go, but we're pretty practical in what we do. If you see a barn here, the cows paid for the barn, and somewhere in my talk, which apparently didn't do too good a job. No, I've not come to it yet. All right, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Doing good. So anyhow, that's kind of what we're about here. We're about selecting performance cattle. They work in this environment. They're going to kind of do it on their own. Now, on their own being supervised, but if you have to be with them, if you have to overfeed them, if you have to overcondition them, if you have to undercondition them, we're kind of geared toward an optimum here, where we can kind of gauge what we're doing, gauge what the cattle are doing, and what works for our customers. Because if it works for us, it's probably going to work for them for the most part. Coming back to what we do today, talking about genetics and selection, I'm not going to overburden you with that, but I will say that I do firmly see the value in collecting an actual birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight. We still do the ultrasound data. I like to see it myself. I think it's worth spending the money on. I like to see what our sires do in comparison to the AI sires that we use, and I like to see how the cattle perform in their contemporary group. I can't overstate how important I feel a contemporary group is and that it's accurate. So we got a few groups of cattle down here. Some of those groups have been broken up, but a group that's in this field is different than a group that's in that field. And I've got a farm that I leased. It's across town, and it was a deal. I probably didn't really need the land, but these people were actually friends of my grandfather and friends of my father and friends of mine. It's an old family operation, and they just got tired of doing it. And they had asked me 10 or 12 years before if I'd be interested in leasing their place if they decided they didn't want to farm anymore, and I told them yes, so they come to me. I'd forgotten to ask them that they asked me. And I said, well, okay, I'll look at it. And they gave me a price I thought I couldn't refuse. Well, it was a great lesson. It was a great lesson. I would have never believed the difference in an environment. And I told someone earlier today, I think it was Michael, that I'd thought about bringing some of those calves out here so you could kind of see the difference, how just growing up on that land is different than here. Dwight had told me before that timber was kind of the same way. If the soil was real good soil, the timber was going to be better. But the performance from the cattle on that side of the county versus the cattle here is significantly different. You know, I can understand another part of the country, but you would have never made me believe that it makes that much difference just across town. So all that being said, the importance of those contemporary groups, the way the animal performs in relation to other animals handled exactly like it is, I think is key to be sure that we maintain that in our selection process. And we do the genomics thing too. I guess I feel like you have to, and I feel like it's pretty good. It's better than I am some days. Some days I'm in a hurry. Some days I'm maybe not in tune with what I'm doing the way I should be, or maybe I walk by the same animal a number of times and I don't really take time to look at it, think about it, and study. You know, what was its birth weight? How had it performed? What does it look like? Well, I get my genomic data. Well, I'm pretty dumb. Had I taken time to look, I would have known that it was 10% below average on birth. He was 10 or 15% below average on weaning weight. But look how its features are. Look how smooth fronted it is. Look how refined it is in its bone structure. Well, guess what? It's a lower birth weight animal. You know, big surprise. So you get your genomics back, and it was in the top 2% of the breed for calving ease and birth weight. Makes you think there's a little bit of something to it. Now, I'm not here to testify about anything being the absolute way to do things, but I do think that it does correlate a lot with what we're doing. So all that information taken together is sort of what I believe in for trying to select animals that are best characterize what the animal really is. I don't think that was supposed to be here in this talk, but I got... Yeah, it is. Sort the genetics. That's what I was talking about. Separate true genetic merit expressed as an EPD from the environment. That's what I meant to say with all that. And I did have in here that if you do everything together and you do it often enough, it's not perfect, but you would have never made me believe 5 or 10 years ago that it's as good as it is for being able to select things, or at least make me think that it's as good as it is in identifying what animals actually are. Now, I get people sometimes that come to me and say, well, if you breed them all the same way, aren't they going to all be the same? No, they're not. Biology, it introduces enough variation to the very best laid plans, I guess is what I'd written on my paper up here. And that's kind of how I look at it. You know, I've bred a animal that's supposed to be this to a bull that's supposed to be that, kind of looking for maybe a similar type animal, and it turns out to be different. You know, the calf comes, it's a bull calf, it comes, it's 10% heavier than the rest of the calves. Maybe not 10, it's 5% heavier, or maybe it is 10. It really grows well. Well, guess what? It's probably got a little more birth weight than its mama and daddy, but it also found that growth that goes with that birth weight. The bottom line is what we really want to do is accurately describe through the data what the animal is. 2 years ago, 3 years ago before the sale, I don't remember, my youngest daughter, Alexandra, who's now a freshman in high school, and a lot of you know, she's in the tractor cab with me. I've got scooped up some kind of dirt or filth that's around the barn here, and I know there's a hole down the road on another little section of a farm there that needs to be filled in. It'd be a great place for that dirt, and it'd be out of sight. So she decides to ride down there with me. Somebody calls, they're asking me a few questions about the cattle in the sale. I'm talking to them. I get off the phone. Now, Dad, you've got to be a little better salesman if you want to sell these things. So I'm thinking, okay, Alexandra, okay, you've got to be a little better salesman. So I stopped and I said, well, Alexandra, what I want them to know is exactly what they are getting. That's what I want them to know. Because if they get what they think they're getting, whatever it is they want, if they get what they think they're getting, they're probably going to be happy. And if they get something different from what they think they're getting, they're probably not going to like it real well, and they're not real likely to come back and see us. They might go somewhere else. So she kind of got a kick out of that after she stopped and thought about it. But that's a true story. I had no sooner hung that up. Now, Dad, you just got to be a little better salesman than that. And what had happened, the gentleman had called me and he'd asked me about a bull, and he was kind of wanting it to be something that I didn't really think that it was. I just didn't think that bull was fitting what he was wanting and where he was in it. It just didn't seem like it was quite right, and she was going to give me a lesson in salesmanship, and I was trying to explain to her what we're trying to get done here. You know, the reason for collecting all this data and all this information is to characterize what we're doing with the best reliability that we can, and you'll always get a curveball thrown. So, we're done with the genetics now. We're on to how do we do things, and what do we do here. And what I do need to say is Angus cattle have been good to me, and they've been good to my family. And I will always believe that. They've allowed us to meet a lot of friends, to go to a lot of events, to have a lot of memories with my family, with my father, with my grandfather that I would have never had. To see a lot of things, experience a lot of things, and in all honesty, the best friends I have are my cattle friends. And none of this would happen, and I say it every time we have a sale, none of this would happen without those friends. You know, I don't know enough people here locally that I can get to come help me to put on the sale and stuff. But you know, you come sale day, you've got your friends sitting in the box, you got your friends standing in the sale ring, you got your friends in the back getting them in and getting out, and some of them even worry about me if I'm actually going to be able to get it done, and sometimes I worry about me too, but they've always been here to help me get it done, and sometimes they think I'm just thanking them, I guess, to be thanking them, but that's how this place works. If it weren't for them, I couldn't get it done, and that's how it's worked really for 25 years. since we've been having these sales. So what do we do specifically? We're primarily a spring calving herd. We calve in February and March, calve my mature cows on stockpile fescue and rolled out hay, not here. If you want to be sure you have a bunch of sick or dead calves, you go right back there on that hill and you start calving them in February in Tennessee. This is slate ground on this side of the farm. The water stays on top. It's nasty. For whatever reason, it just doesn't work right back up this valley. So what we do is we calve up behind my house. The soil's a little bit different. It drains better. I try to split the cows up into groups of no more than 40. If I can get them a little bit smaller than that, you have a little less problem with disease. When I first got out of veterinary school, we had scours. It was awful, had all kinds of problems with it. And knock on something, since we started doing this several years ago, all that's kind of gone away. We don't have too many health problems in those baby calves. I used to try to have the cows in 6 or 8 acres where I can watch them, and I quit doing that. I found out I was better off if they're out in the field. I'm not real likely to have a problem. It's a lot cleaner. A guy told me, I was wanting to do some horse business when I first got out of veterinary school, and I went and met this guy. He's a pretty prominent horse breeder and did a pretty good job with his horses. And he told me once, he said, you know, the good Lord made a pretty good machine if you'll take care of it. He was talking about a mare having a foal. And I guess I firmly believe that about an Angus cow. If she's not too fat, if she's not too thin, if she's kind of the right kind of cow, and you put her in a decent environment, she's probably going to do a pretty good job. That's where we've arrived at in this business. So they've been good to me. Following the sale, those cows are grouped up at these other places. And my house is just up the road, and that farm basically connects back through here. But you go from this slate to a little more red dirt. It drains better. You got more cover in a big valley. And I can divide that valley into different groups so I can split my cows up. I got one field across the road, and it works a lot better. But we bring them down here. We synchronize them with the cedars. Breed them AI one time, and then I turn them with cleanup bulls. And where they go will depend on a little bit about what kind of season we're having, how much grass we've got. I do keep the 2-year-olds here because I have the corn silage and I can supplement them. They're not going to breed back trying to raise a calf with as much growth as we've tried to put in them, trying to raise a calf on fescue in Tennessee without a little bit of supplement. But my mature cows, for the most part, go to different farms away from here, and we take a cleanup bull and things go a lot better like that. I try to manage the cattle together, so I have a group of yearling heifers that we're breeding, keep my 2-year-olds together. A lot of times 3- and 4-year-olds are together, and then my older mature cows are together. Things work a little bit better for me that way. Fall calving cows, they don't do as well for me, but it's a necessary evil. I'm not perfect, and my world's not perfect, so not all my spring calving cows are going to breed. Some of them are going to breed, and then they're going to lose it, and then they're going to breed back late to the bull or whatever. But we have a fall calving program that I have a few cows in, and I'll calve them at different places depending on the season. Sometimes I do calve them here. In the fall, you can get by with it. This year I've got them up beside my house because there's all kinds of grass up there, but I'll bring them down here and breed them. The way we've got the farm laid out is this road is basically an alley. It's kind of narrow here, and then it gets wider and more narrow in places, but you've got access to fields on both sides of the farm. One field back here actually goes into about 300 acres back that direction, and you can divide cattle up in that limestone ground. It's a little bit better, but they have access to limestone with those calves where it drains better, plus they can come and you can feed them a little silage in the winter and they'll do a little bit better. Previous to that, my fall calving cows would about starve to death. Not the cows so much, the calves. I could always get the cows bred. The calves would look terrible come spring. It just wouldn't work at all, but that's helped out a lot with that. It's all a work in progress, continual evolution. You know, we've got the concrete bunks, makes it easier to catch the cattle, just trying to make the work a little bit easier. So if you go back the lane, the cattle come into the lane, they eat at the concrete bunk, you can close the gate behind them, you've got them caught if you need to breed them, synchronize them, do something to them, work the calves, whatever you need to do. It makes it a lot easier to handle and manage them. And I guess I should emphasize it's all kind of been a gradual adaptation over time. Marketing, first Saturday in April we have a production sale. We put our bulls and our females together, do it here, and that's been really good for us. It's been good for our family. Years ago, I used to try to have a fall sale too, and to be honest, it was physically and emotionally exhausting for me to try to get that done. And those of you that have sales know kind of what that feeling is sometimes. But it's been good. I've always felt like the grass time right around the 1st of April is an excellent time to sell cattle, and it's worked good for us. So what else we've got to do today that listen to me to talk? The good news is I'm about done, unless someone has questions. But what I've got is I've got some cattle pinned up here. And basically what it is, it's the cattle that were accessible. I've got a group of yearling heifers in the far pen. I've got a group of 2-year-olds and calves right here. I've got some 3-year-olds in the 3rd pen going that way, or 2nd pen coming up. And then the far pen down there, the 1st pen's got some cows that I flushed. Some of the mothers of these featured and top selling bulls are in there. There's a few calves that are in there. So what we'd like for you to have time to do here is, if you'd like to visit with one another, we'd love for you to do that. If you want to walk around and look at the cattle, we'd love for you to do that. If you want some more to eat or drink, I think Ben's still got something to eat or drink. If you want to get on the mule and go back to the corral where all the Indian stuff is and look around, you're welcome to do that, or take this truck. And Dwight had mentioned to me sometimes people like to look at barns and cattle working facilities. What we have is nothing fancy, okay? It's just all what has evolved to work for us over time. This chute and tub system down here, we've about outgrown it. It seems like we get more cows that we need to work than it was really designed for. I remember when I was in college, our spring calving herd was up to 37, and we had a drought and we didn't know how we were going to feed them. So that was kind of an interesting memory. It was 100 degrees that summer. I always grew tobacco in the summers when I was in school because it was really good for us then. I paid for my veterinary school, but I can distinctly remember having 37 spring calving cows, and we weren't really sure how we were going to feed them. So there is a paper that has the history of the farm. Some people like to keep stuff from tours and things. You're welcome to that. I've got a paper that lists our bulls, our bull calves that we have this year. The heifers are kind of same breeding, but they're heifers. The genomic data is included on most of those bulls. There's a set of mature cows that I don't have the blood on the calves yet. This year, Lori and I had a great idea while we're doing all this work in the spring. You're going to have to bleed them calves anyway. Why don't you go ahead and do it now? So I did. So I've got some of that data included. But if you want to see kind of the sires we used and stuff, they'll be on one of those papers there. And then I got a little sheet. It's the calf sires. You know, it worked out not like I thought it was going to work out. I'd used the Niagara bulls so much in my mature cows, and I'd moved so many of them out of here. I don't have too many of those calves. So I got a bunch of Whitlock calves down here. So the calves are listed in alphabetical or numerical order. So if you look down the list, you see a calf, you want to know what it is. It's easy to see if you want to take that paper and look. And on the back's a little map that kind of tells you what things are. But that's basically all I have, and probably more than I actually had. I do want to thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. I want to thank you for being on this tour and celebrating 100 years of East Tennessee Angus. If you're not involved in this organization a whole lot, and I don't know if all of you are or not, it's an excellent organization. The people that are running it for you are some of the best people that you'll ever be around or have a chance to be involved with. So if you're thinking about becoming involved in the East Tennessee organization, I'd highly recommend you do it. And we're glad you love Angus cattle. We do too. If there's anything, Lori, I can do for you, if you have any questions, we appreciate you being here. Marcus can testify to how well my cattle do on the other side of town. He actually came out and looked at some of them bull calves back earlier in the spring. So I'm done. Y'all can do whatever you want to. You're welcome. You got the run of the place. Does anybody have any questions, or if I talk way too much? Or
how many acres you farm here, including what you got left?
Well, I'm convinced the people I lease the land from don't know how much land they have. Okay? They tell me they've got that I have 200 acres leased. I think they've got more land than they realize. Now, there's 12 heirs in this family, okay? So I don't know exactly if they all know. To me, I'd say it's 250 to 300 acres that I've got leased. We own 1,200 acres. That's what we own here. We calved about 200 cows this spring, maybe a few over 200 cows this spring, calved about 20, 25 in the fall. Something like that's where we're at numbers-wise. It's not pretty, it's not fancy, but it kind of works. It could work a lot better with a little better management day-to-day on the land. I had a gentleman that was a little bit younger than me that was helping me. Did a really nice job. He actually worked at the stockyard, had a few of his own commercial cows, come and feed for me in the mornings, run the little mixer wagon. I didn't even talk about my corn silage. I must have missed that page. That's good. Y'all lucked out. But he'd feed my bulls and my heifers and my 2-year-olds for me. He had a stroke the day after Christmas, right back there. We loaded him up in the truck and they landed the helicopter about where the bus is and took him out of here. And he's doing okay, but he's slow to recover. And he'd been a really good help for me, and he was a really good guy. I'd known him for years, just never got together to get him hired. So, you know, finding good quality people, as you all know, it's not impossible, but it can be a little bit challenging, a little difficult at times that you want to put on your machinery and turn them loose, particularly on these hills if it's wet or something like that. You know, you just have to be a little bit concerned about what might happen. So, yeah.
The cows are flushing if you've got cooperators you're putting eggs in. I know you're not putting them in your bottom end cows.
I have some commercial cows that I put them in, is what I do. And over the years, Dwight got me actually started in that back in the 90s. Dwight had some pretty good cows, and he'd made me a little deal if we could get the eggs put in. If I'd furnish the cows and raise them, he'd partner with me on some of the cattle, and that helped. I hope it helped him out. It helped me out a lot. But that's kind of what got me started. At that time, when I first got out of veterinary school, I couldn't do embryo transfer work. Edwin Robertson and Sam came over and did that, and that was something I'd always been interested in. And I just asked them, I said, if I want to learn how to do this, what do I need to do? And they said, just come to our seminar, Lee. So that's actually another pretty neat story about how commercial embryo transfer that we all take for granted kind of today come to be. So Lori and I go to this seminar in Pittsburgh. It's Edwin and 4 other veterinarians. Tom probably knows who some of them are. I remember Reuben Mapletoft was one, and I think he was from Canada. I remember there's a guy from Michigan, a guy from Texas. There's one more, can't remember who he was. That's the 5 guys that figured out how to make embryo transfer work on your farm. I thought it was pretty neat. And so what they did at the Bovine Practitioners Conference, they had a little embryo transfer seminar. Edwin had told me it had always been our policy, if you're a veterinarian and want to learn, we want you to learn. We want to teach you. And they really helped me, but that was kind of how we got into that business. I thought it was a neat story about how those guys, and they remained friends until gradually most of them kind of passed away and stuff, but brought different perspectives from universities to private practice, and they talked to each other on the phone and kind of explained at that seminar how they came up with the procedures and stuff. Of course, a lot of it's been modified and changed. It's so much better now than it was even when I started from a procedure standpoint, but that's a pretty neat deal, really, how those guys did that. So commercial cows, that's what I got. I don't have a great lot of them. When Dwight and I were doing that, my cows weren't as, at least I didn't think they were as good. I think they're better now. I don't do as much of it, but I do some. So we'll have 30, maybe 30, 35 embryo transfer calves a year. That's what we'll do.
How and what do you feed the bull?
It's a silage-based ration, okay? So to me, a key thing of being able to do stuff is to being able to get in that mixer wagon and go back through here and feed 300, 325 pretty quickly and be done with it. They kind of come to you, and if they don't come, the right number doesn't come, then you know something's sick or something's wrong. You know, coming to those bunks, that makes it work a little bit better for me. So Jason Smith at the University of Tennessee probably helped me more than anybody as far as balancing my ration and figuring out what I needed to do. Compared to most people, I traditionally don't feed as much, I guess. I mean, I guess that's what I get out of it from looking at them. If I send a bull to a test station, which I still do because a lot of my friends do, and we get to go on trips to the test station and talk about what we like and don't like, it makes it fun, but they always get a lot fatter. Seems like they get a little bit heavier. But it's kind of like me. I guess the way I look at it, if I sit on the couch a little bit longer and eat a few more Cheetos, it's probably not going to be quite as good for me either. So that's always a balancing act, Dwight, and you know that. It was a leading question. I guess you want me to talk about it a little bit. Yeah.
You have feet problem in your bulls, feed them the way you feed them.
Sometimes. Now, do I always know why? Or if I really have a foot problem? I don't know. You know, that's an issue that's on the top of a lot of people's minds because I get a lot of questions about it. You know, people will ask. So I got a bull back from the sale. It's a guy I've known for 20 years. And I know him. He's a little bit different, but everybody is, so that's all right. We've always got along. The bull's feet are okay. The bull's not lame. But he and his friends had decided that when that bull got bigger, they thought he might have feet problems. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating or making that up, Lori's back there shaking her head laughing. She knows I'm not. So I said, well, okay, why don't you just bring him back? So he was fine with that. So I've got the bull back. He's a little bit thinner than he was when he left, but I think he'll be okay. But some people get that in their mind. Now, does it happen sometimes? It probably does, Dwight. I don't know. You know, I don't guess I get a call. The way I look at it is, you know, some people that should complain probably don't call you. You know, probably something that maybe should have been prevented or could have been prevented. They don't call you, and then a guy calls you because he thinks something might go wrong. I mean, it happens. But he's happy, and life's too short for me not to be happy, so I'm going to be happy. So he gets a credit for his bull in the sale, and I'll have a 2-year-old bull to grow out, and if he's sure enough okay, somebody will want him next spring. It's kind of how I look at it. So, but do I think it makes a difference? If they don't go through laminitis, yes, I think it makes a difference. If the ration is too hot, or if it's too hot too quick, I guess I feel like you get laminitis in the feet, and you're a little more likely to have some problems. Now, one thing that I corrected several years ago, I wasn't putting enough limestone in it. So I had some bulls that had some soft soles. Well, I couldn't figure out what was wrong. So they'd invented internet by now. I started reading about it, which was dangerous. Probably shouldn't have done that. And it was something as simple as I probably needed to add a little more limestone to my ration. And I think that greatly helped the bulls. When it gets wet and stays wet for months and they're in the manure and filth, I think that's kind of bad on them too. But I will go ahead and say this. Since you brought it up, a lot of people talk about it, and something I do firmly believe, that if the cattle are managed maybe a little more practically, there's probably going to be fewer problems in all of them. The other side of the coin is, if you'd told me 20 years ago, or when I was a kid, or maybe even 15 years ago, that I could have cattle that would perform the way these cattle perform and do the things they do and do it in that predictable a manner, I'd have never believed you. I mean, I would have literally never believed that I could walk out in my field and I would have a calf standing there that had performed like that. It didn't seem possible. My first cow, when I sold her as a mature cow, weighed 775 pounds. She was a monster, and she was sired by a performance-tested Angus bull in the 70s. So it's kind of changed a little bit. I didn't mention for the display, I do have 3 cows over here, and that was partly, since you brought it up, 2 of them will be 15 in November. 1 of them will be 15 in January. I think I didn't get their papers up. They're stuck behind the sign over there. 2 of them have spring calves, and the other one's going to calve this fall. You know, there's some value in some cows that'll hang around and do that. One of them had her top selling bull and top performing bull in 2012. Another one had the top selling bull in 2007. And the other one I was a little slow on the uptake on. She just kept hanging around and raising calves and raising calves. Well, you start looking back in her pedigree. She's a black miss. You start looking back in her pedigrees and you start finding her. You know, cattle that are at the top, she's back there in that pedigree. She's done us a really good job. Hung around for a long time. But they're on your little paper, but they're in the little alley over through here. And I don't expect them to be, I mean, they ran out with the other cows. So they've just been handled like they are, and they're not brought in here to look like show cattle or anything, but they've done a lot of things right for a long time. I'm sorry.
You made reference to the leased farm and the unbelievable difference.
Yes.
Elaborate there a little bit.
Well, I wish I knew. I'll be honest with you, okay? Like I said, this farm has 12 heirs, and I've known these people my entire life. Now, some of them have passed away, obviously as they've gotten older. The story of the farm is actually interesting. It's the old John Bohannon farm. John Bohannon, way back when, was a real influential, hard-working guy here in Greenville that had a mind for getting things done. He was a successful businessman that wore overalls every day and had his pencil and paper right here in his front pocket. When everybody in town couldn't figure out how to unload the printing press off the railroad car for the newspaper when it came to town, John went and looked at it. They said he figured on his paper a minute and gave him a price. They said, "That's awfully high." And he said, "Well, whatever y'all want to do." So, back then there weren't cranes, there weren't anything. John went and got blocks of ice and stacked them up beside the railroad car. They slid the press over. And then they melted the ice, I guess, with water to lower it down. So he was the kind of guy that could do things. There's story after story after story. It was his original farm. There's 12 heirs. There had just been cattle there. No fertilizer. They didn't bush hog it. They mowed the hay once a year. They grazed it. Now on the farm there's an old concrete trench where John had a pretty nice trench silo. He'd grown corn in those fields, but they hadn't done that for years. I don't know why, other than the soil's different. Now, I do believe that probably this section of Greene County is some of the poorest from a soil quality standpoint of the county. So I don't know enough about soil or haven't done enough testing to know that, yeah, we like this and we like that. I know that when we need lime and what we need to do with our fertilizer and stuff, but I don't know. That land's not fertilized, and a whole lot of our pasture land's not fertilized here. If it is fertilized here on this farm, they still won't do as well as they will out there. Now up behind my house, they'll do a little better, and like I said earlier, it drains better. It's that more red dirt, similar to what's out there. And I wish I knew the difference. I wish I knew, but it was quite a lesson in the difference in genetics and environment, because those calves, when I genomic test them, when they go on feed, they're not going to perform like the calves. The ones that are up at my house would have traditionally been over there, but we had so much grass I took them up there. But they're not going to perform like these calves, how these younger cows do. When we get going and get all the data in on them, I don't think. But if you went and looked at them today, that would be the calves. They just look. And Marcus, he came out there. I guess I was breeding on them when you came out there.
Yeah, the calves, it was in, I guess in April, the calves, in February calves, man,
Yeah, I'm looking at something like I would have never imagined owning myself. I'm just like, did somebody go somewhere and get these things? And they were Niagara calves, that's why I'd call Marcus. I've got other Niagara calves that had been managed here. There's just a difference, and I wish I knew why. Now, Tom, of course, and many of you knew Ralph Bridges, and Ralph and my dad were really good friends, and Ralph and I were friends. He had a ranch in Montana, and I can still remember him telling me, he said, "Lee," he said, "when I take a cow from Georgia to Montana, the first thing she does is gain 300 pounds. I don't know all the whys and wherefores about that. Tom might say because they had somebody out there that fed her. I don't know, but but anyhow, there is a difference, and I wish I knew what it was. And there's a significant difference from right here and up at my house, which, like I said, the land itself kind of connects, but it does change from this slate. We're limestone over on that side of the creek. And then we're slate on this side. There's a creek down here. We're slate on this side. And then you roll back over these hills. My house is kind of that direction. And if you go straight back this valley and then veer slightly to the left, you come out in the field across the road from my house. But the land changes. It changes to more of a red type dirt. And you get away from the slate and you're back into some limestone. Right over here, it just sticks out of the ground. The rock's out of the ground. You got some caves and stuff underneath it. Now up there, it doesn't stick out of the ground like that. So it's just a little different soil. Land on the other side of Greene County, my dad always said they sold by the bucket. The land values were better there. Maybe people just knew the farms were better there. I don't know, but that was the reference he always made. He said they sell that land over there by the bucket. Shoo, I doubt it. We've got Richland Creek running through it that takes all the trash out of Greenville. Yeah.
One's on city water, one's got pond.
Yeah.
Pond water, where the whole valley drains into it.
Yeah.
Put the cows through there.
Yeah. On the pond water. Really. I've done pond and city. The way we're set up here is there's a pond kind of right back there. You can't see it, but you can kind of see where the dam is. Homer knows way too well where it is because he's worked on this dang pond pump too many times. But we're wired into the city water with it now. The pond got slow in the drought 2 years ago? 2 years ago, the pond got slow. We'd had droughts before, but I never thought the pond was going to dry up. But we hooked onto the city. So I've done it both ways here. I've done pond, and I've done, pond in these big tires. I've done pond and I've done the city, and I can't, I mean, Rick, it's just different. I don't know why, but it has to be something. Dwight said trees were the same way. He said if the soil wasn't as good, and I may be telling his story wrong, but he said they'd have cracks in them or more dead places in them, and he said, and if the soil was better, he said those trees would just be hard, like they're supposed to be. Is that saying it kind of right, Dwight?
On the north side of the bridge, where you get more shade, you've got better nutrients, and usually your water, you don't dry out as quick on the north face. And the same thing with grass. If you look at these old hills that on the south face, they'll dry out.
Right.
And the grass is not as good.
Right.
So,
this time of year, those hills right there are typically brown. I mean, you know how it is. It's just rained this year, and it's rained like it doesn't rain is what it's done. But typically these slate hills are burned and brown. But even if they have grass here, what I try to do is adjust my numbers. I was able to spread out enough, adjust my numbers to where it would kind of be okay. They just don't. They just don't. Yeah. Yes, I do. What I do is I'll calve my 2-year-olds here. Okay, that's the only cattle I'll calve here. And I can spread out at a few places back through here. And then if it's too messy, too much, then I'll just punt and I'll load up the rest of them and I'll move them. But the way it typically works, I try to breed my heifers just a little bit. A heifer will usually calve early anyway, but I'm going to breed them first so I can get that out of the way. So where I'm going to calve them, I try to wait to the last minute before I get them in. I've not had anything in there for months, and it's just grown up in grass. So maybe I can have 25 calves in a week or something like that and kind of get that out of the way. This field across the road I save, and they do pretty good in there. There's 60 acres, and they can go in there and they can spread out. We roll the hay out to them. I don't feed them any silage or anything until the calves start growing, after they calve. They get to be a month and a half, 2 months old. I'll start feeding them a little bit, but I just kind of let them get through that first portion on hay. And we move the hay all the time. Ronnie that came in on the tractor, he doesn't like it. I move too much for him, and he don't like cutting strings off the hay, but it just works a lot better. And it does get aggravating. It gets aggravating when I have to feed too. But the 2-year-olds will be a little bit weather dependent, typically twice a day. The reason I like to have them here, occasionally, and we didn't have it this year, or I missed calving it anyway, but occasionally I remember standing here, it gets depressing. So you've had 0 or less for not consistent. I mean, we are in Tennessee, but it has been, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't remember. We had like that 2.5 weeks of a cold snap, and it was cold, and then it iced. So I'm standing here looking at ice right out across from there. So I've been out here in all the fields I'm supposed to be in, and then I'm in here calving, which I don't do, but I'm just trying to get along. I've got my friends with commercial cows calling, telling me how many calves they've lost and all this mess and stuff, and my mature cows are calving out. If they can find some shelter, if they can have it out of the snow, where the calf's not coming out in the snow, whether it's in hay or whether they get up under a cedar tree or something like that, I get along good. But I like to be able to put my 2-year-olds in the barn, and then I'll come check them at midnight. I used to check them more, and I got older, but midnight is my cutoff, isn't it, Lori? That is my cutoff anymore. I figure if I check them then I can come back at 6 in the morning and, honey, you're on your own then, you're going to have to. But it works good for me, and the cattle have adapted, and they do that. It's just, I'm not saying I don't have a dead calf from time to time. I do. It's going to happen, but as far as like having a wreck or something like that, which I could have, I just hadn't had one in a while. But that's kind of how I manage them. I do try to keep the 2-year-olds here, and they go across the road, and then the other cows are out. Because you can't go back in those fields. It won't work. If you try to go over there, I used to try that. There's so many sinkholes, your calves get in holes. It's kind of sad sometimes. They can do that when they get older. I had one that fell butt first down in a hole. I found him. I was able to find him. I got him out, and the pressure on his tail had been so much it all rotted off. His entire tail and part up his back came off. Had to keep him in the barn to keep the flies off of it, and it eventually granulated in, and we had to eat him because you couldn't have sold him for a steer. They'd outlawed him, but there wasn't anything wrong with him. It's one of those things. But that's why you can't go over there. They get in those little sinkholes and stuff, fall in those things.
That's the one we ate today.
Now, I enjoyed my lunch today, Homer. And Ben's the one that selected that. I think he furnished the meat for that. Yeah. Yep, we do. You get a lot of experiences in things doing it over time, and a lot of memories and stuff that are tied to you. And we talked about having a spring sale and a fall sale. Well, we were fortunate enough, as several of you know, we had a fall sale on Saturday. It's the 11th, Wednesday, 12th. Would that have been September 15th, 2001? Tom was here for that, for part of it. So my auctioneer didn't make it that day. My auctioneer didn't make it. The guy that I'd hired didn't make it, but Scotty Crawford was here to work the ring. He has a Tennessee auction license, and Scotty sold the cattle that day, and he's sold them every day since that day. But a lot of the memories that are tied to stuff.
What's your criteria for when you decide, well, that cow's done off, I'm going to do it myself?
If she gets hurt, sometimes they get hurt. If she gets arthritis, if for some reason she fails to perform, some of them, fortunately, we're skewing it. When you breed for something, you're breeding kind of like they put the hurricanes on TV. You've got a cone, okay? You're trying to skew it in whatever direction you're wanting to go with your selection. But when the chromosomes assort and the DNA does what it does, you get some scatter. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes a heifer gets mastitis when she's a yearling heifer and she calves and she's got one tit that works. Something like that. But for the most part, I feel like most of them work. And I will say this, and I should have mentioned this, all this decoration and stuff in here, which is really nice for us. Now, it might not be nice for everybody, but for us, this is really nice, that I had nothing to do with and did absolutely zero of. My wife did for me. But these are some featured bulls and stuff that we've had over the years on the wall. And what she does is she'll go to the Tennessee Cattlemen's meeting. We try to get some pictures beforehand. Artistic printers out here can put them on something like that so she can set it up so people have something to look at. But when you start going through who these featured bulls are, if I'd tried to pick out what their mother was going to be when she was a weaned heifer, I'd have missed. I would have missed. So I try to use them. If they're going to work and if they're going to do, unless they're crazy or something like that, which again, it can still happen. Now we select for docility because our customers select for docility. But with that cone, things happen. If they're crazy, if they get hurt, if they have something obviously wrong with them, I cull them. I took a cow Saturday. I made myself do it because she was a good cow. She's 9 years old. When she calved this year, her tits were too big. I'd had to milk her. The year before, the calf had somehow nursed and he'd gone on and done well. I had to milk her, and I thought, if I don't sell her now while I've got her caught, I won't, and she'll calve, and I'll be milking her again next January, February, late January, early February, something like that, while I need to be doing something else, and I won't be happy. So that was the reason that I culled her. But that's typically why, when something's wrong. Interestingly enough, on the feet, and a friend of mine posed this question to me, kind of a topic people talk about a lot. Brian McCullough asked me, he said, Lee, how many cows a year do you cull because of their feet? So I started thinking about it. Well, I culled one this year. She was 15, so I didn't feel too bad about it. But now her feet had been grown out for a while, and I don't know why they were like that, but they were, and I'd trimmed them a time or two. I don't trim feet on cow. I can't. I can't get it done. They're going to have to work. But I've learned a few things about those feet that's kind of interesting. I did have a heifer last year that as a 2-year-old, she calves, she comes through the chute. Her toes are long on those hind feet. They're not really curled or anything, but I'm thinking, well, this is a disaster. I'll be culling her because she'll have something wrong with her. When I weaned her calf, they'd worn off. So she's calved as a 3-year-old. She's getting ready to wean this calf, here in a month or so. So I don't know. Part of that, I guess I think, is put them in a healthy environment, not too fat, not too thin. Maybe they have a few of the minerals they need and they'll do okay. But that's when I cull them, it's just when something goes wrong. Oh, it went fine. Since you asked, okay, the cow was out. The cow was out on the rented farm. Okay, she was out on the rented farm. I talked about selecting for docility. She weighed a little over 1,500 pounds when I sold her Saturday, so she wasn't small. She was out on the rented farm. So their facilities, what I do is I take some alleyway panels in my portable chute out there when I work my cows. But I didn't have that out there because it was winter and I wasn't working my cows. They've got an old head gate and a gate you can open to get beside the cow. So I had the veterinarian that works with me, Dr. Cook, we were talking about some things. So I had her on speakerphone and my phone laying there while I was milking the cow. And I had my bottle. I let the calf nurse the bottle first, then I got the calf on the cow, and then everything was good. But yeah, it went great. So back to the docility thing, it works better than you think sometimes. If it doesn't work better, then I start that cussing and slinging and throwing fit that Stout's over there laughing about, and that's a reason to cull a cow. I've probably got a few, but she didn't cause any. Fortunately, she didn't cause any. Have y'all heard enough from me, or are there more questions? And I'm happy to answer. I'll talk all day if y'all want to talk about cattle. I love doing it, but. Okay?
Thank you, Lee.
Oh, thank you all. Thank you all.